Nobody expected to see this inside towns that were abandoned overnight. Residents left their meals on the tables, but they didn't leave alone. In one specific quarantine zone, military teams found something roaming the empty streets that defies every law of biology. Join us and let's discover the top 10 unexplained finds inside evacuated towns. Let's go!
Number 12, Pripyat, Ukraine, School Number 3. There's one room in the abandoned city of Pripyat that gets talked about more than almost any other site in the exclusion zone. A classroom in School Number 3, where the entire floor is covered completely wall to wall with gas masks. Hundreds of them. Hollow. If you've never seen this room, your first instinct is probably that the masks were dropped during a panicked evacuation, people grabbing them and losing them as they ran. That is not what happened. The real story is darker. In the months and years after the Chernobyl disaster in April 1986, looters broke into the school repeatedly. Soviet-era gas mask filters contained small amounts of silver, valuable enough to strip out and sell on the black market. The looters took every single filter. What they left behind were the empty rubber shells, hundreds of hollow masks scattered across the classroom floor. But the masks were never worn during the actual disaster, and that detail is the one that cuts deepest. Not long before the accident, students in Pripyat had participated in civil defense drills, practicing repeatedly how to put on those exact masks in an emergency. Everyone in the Soviet Union was trained for an attack from outside. Nobody was prepared for a reactor 3 kilometers from their own school. When reactor number 4 exploded on April 26, 1986, the Communist Party made a specific, deliberate decision. Evacuation orders went out, but officials told residents explicitly not to put on gas masks in public. The reasoning was direct. If citizens started appearing in gas masks in the streets, it would create visible panic, and that panic would make the Soviet emergency response look inadequate on the world stage. So the children of Pripyat evacuated without protection. They walked through radioactive air with their faces uncovered, and the empty mask shells ended up on that floor, scattered like the aftermath of a collapse that the government chose to allow. It wasn't the last government to make that choice, but an island in Japan turned an entire city into ruins for a different kind of reason entirely.
Number 11, St. Thomas, Nevada. St. Thomas, Nevada didn't collapse or burn or get contaminated. It drowned on purpose. In 1938, after the Hoover Dam was completed and Lake Mead began filling behind it, the rising waters of the Colorado River swallowed the entire town. At its peak depth, St. Thomas sat under roughly 90 feet of water. That's equivalent to a 9-story building pressing down on it from above. It stayed there, crushed and silent, for nearly 60 years. Then, the droughts hit the American West hard. As Lake Mead's water levels dropped catastrophically through the 2000s and 2010s, St. Thomas began resurfacing. First, just foundations, then walls, then roads, then the cemetery. When the town was scheduled to be submerged back in the 1930s, the federal government was responsible for relocating every body buried in the local cemetery before the flood. They didn't get them all. As silt and water pulled back over the past 2 decades, concrete burial vault lids began emerging from the mud. Many of them cracked, some completely displaced, shifted by nearly a century of underwater pressure. Several vaults had been forced open entirely. The headstones that are still standing have had their inscriptions completely erased, not vandalized, just smoothed away by decades of sediment and hydraulic force until they're nothing but blank gray slabs. No names, no dates, no history. A drowned cemetery that refuses to stay buried, surfacing piece by piece every time there's a drought. The federal government says all remains were properly accounted for before the flood. Explorers who have walked the site say the number of vault lids that have emerged doesn't match that claim. Somebody is still down there. And now, a town that was sealed not by water, but by a government order that gave its entire population 4 days to vanish, and then abandoned them to the Arctic.
I'm going to ask you a simple question. Are you a naturally curious person? If you're watching, I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. This space is made for people like us. To ensure you're always part of this community and receive all our latest discoveries, you just need to do one thing: subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to stay connected with us. Okay, now that you're part of our Legion of the Curious, let's move on to the next item.
Number 10, Bodie, California. Bodie is probably the most famous ghost town in America. At its peak in the late 1870s, it held nearly 10,000 people, a gold rush boomtown so lawless that journalists called it the most violent place in the American West. Today, it's a California State Historic Park maintained in what officials call arrested decay. Nothing is restored, nothing is cleaned. Objects are left exactly where they sat when the last residents walked out. That policy led to one of the most intimate discoveries on this list: a leather briefcase found jammed under the floorboards of a collapsed boarding house. No gold, no cash, no claim deed to a mine. What it contained was the complete wreckage of one man's private life. Bundles of handwritten letters tied with string, legal documents from a failed business partnership, handwritten maps with locations marked in a code nobody has deciphered, papers detailing a bitter, complicated divorce settlement, and love letters, multiple of them, that were never sent. Not unsent because they were rough drafts, unsent because someone clearly decided at the very last moment not to give them to the person they were written for. The letters weren't addressed to his wife. The briefcase was deliberately hidden beneath the floorboards, not forgotten in a drawer or a closet, hidden with intent. Whoever put it there was burying something they couldn't burn and couldn't carry: shame, debt, longing, or all three at once. The boarding house collapsed around it over the next century. The briefcase outlasted the building, the town, the era, and almost certainly the man who hid it. Some secrets survive absolutely everything. But in Alabama, something survived that nobody expected to find still standing at all.
Number 9. Sanji, Taiwan. On the northern coast of Taiwan, along a stretch of Pacific coastline that should have been prime real estate, there was once a neighborhood of circular, pod-shaped vacation structures that looked designed for a science fiction film. Sanji, also written as Sanji, was a futuristic resort project built in the late 1970s and early 1980s, funded by private developers who planned to market the bubble-shaped units to wealthy buyers. The design was genuinely alien: white circular pods stacked on elevated stilts, with round portholes for windows and connecting walkways, looking somewhere between a lunar habitat and a collection of flying saucers that had landed on the Taiwanese coastline. Construction began in 1978. Then it stopped. The developers ran out of money. The project was abandoned completely in 1980, leaving roughly 100 of the pod structures standing in various states of completion, empty along the coast. What happened next is the part nobody officially explains. Workers who had been on site claimed, before the structures were demolished in 2008, that a series of fatal accidents had occurred during construction, enough of them and strange enough in circumstance that local laborers began refusing to return. Taiwanese folk belief holds that disturbing the ground during construction can awaken malevolent forces. The specific rumor that spread was that a decorative dragon statue had been destroyed during early excavation, and the deaths that followed were not coincidental. The developers reportedly refused to install traditional spirit shrines on the site because doing so would have been an admission. In 2008, the pod structures were demolished. No official photographic record of the demolition was maintained or released. The land has been empty since. No development has been attempted. Nothing has been built there again. But the most disturbing detail on this entire list isn't in Taiwan or France or Japan. It's embedded in the most famous disaster story in modern history, and it directly connects every single place on this list.
Number 8. Hashima Island, Japan. Hashima Island is 9 acres of concrete surrounded by open ocean in the East China Sea. To picture 9 acres, imagine roughly 6.5 city blocks. Now imagine cramming over 5,000 people into that space, a population density higher than the most crowded neighborhoods in Manhattan. That was Hashima at its peak in the 1950s. The island was owned by Mitsubishi and functioned as a submarine coal mining facility, with miners drilling nearly a kilometer below the seabed. To house the workforce and their families, Mitsubishi built massive concrete apartment towers that covered virtually every inch of land. There was a school, a hospital, a pachinko parlor, a rooftop garden, a swimming pool, a cinema, an entire city compressed into 9 acres, surrounded by nothing but water. In 1974, the coal ran out. Mitsubishi gave the workers 1 month's notice and closed Hashima permanently. 5,000 people packed up in weeks, most taking almost nothing. What remained has been off-limits until limited tourism opened in 2009. The apartment towers are collapsing in slow motion. Decades of typhoon salt spray have fractured the concrete throughout. Entire floors have caved in, leaving furniture and belongings visible through the gaps. But the elementary school is partially intact. Inside it, children's art projects are still pinned to bulletin boards. Report cards still sit in their cubbies. A lunchbox remains on one desk, its contents reduced to a dark stain in the plastic. The island became famous as the setting for a villain's lair in the James Bond film Skyfall. But what actually happened on that island before 1974? The forced wartime labor, the deaths,
The decades of official denial is a history the Japanese government resisted acknowledging for generations. In France, a government made the opposite choice. They kept everything exactly as it was, so the world could never look away.
Number 7. Coleman's Cop, Namibia. In 1908, a railroad worker named Zacharias Lawala found a diamond in the sand near a small railway outpost in what was then German Southwest Africa. Within months, a boomtown had erupted from nothing. Coleman's Cop, named after a transport driver who once got his wagon stuck there in a sandstorm, became one of the wealthiest small settlements in the world almost overnight. German colonists built mansions, a hospital with the first X-ray machine in the southern hemisphere, an ice factory, a casino, a bowling alley, a ballroom, and a theater with the finest acoustics in the region. By the 1920s, Coleman's Cop was fully operational. Then, richer diamond deposits were found along the coast further south. Workers and investors left for the new sites. By 1956, Coleman's Cop was empty, and the Namib Desert moved in immediately. Sand poured through cracked windows. It crept under doors, through foundation gaps, through every crack it could find. It rose up the interior walls inch by inch, year by year, decade by decade. Today, the rooms of Coleman's Cop's mansions are filled to varying heights with clean, golden brown Namib sand. Some rooms knee-deep, some waist-deep, some filled almost to the ceiling. Furniture sits partially buried. A piano sits with sand up past its keys. Dining tables emerge from dunes. The hospital's original X-ray machine is still there, rusted but intact, still pointed at the treatment table where patients once lay. The casino's ballroom has sand drifted up to the level of the chandeliers. And yet the buildings stand, because the dry desert air has preserved the structures perfectly. The Namib doesn't rot things, it buries them. Slow, patient, inevitable. But in Missouri, what buried an American town came not from nature. It came from a contract signed with a man nobody thought to investigate.
Number 6. Alabama Iron Belt Ghost Towns. In the forested hills of northern Alabama, scattered across ridgelines that used to anchor the industrial iron and coal belt, there are several old company towns that were simply left behind when the mines went dry in the mid-20th century. Fully built communities, houses, churches, schools, company stores that emptied out over a few years as the work vanished and families relocated. Most structures have collapsed completely. Roofs caved in, floors rotted through, walls buckled outward. But in one superintendent's manor house, explorers found something upright in an upper bedroom, where part of the ceiling had already fallen in. On a mannequin, positioned squarely facing the window, was a wedding dress. Everything else in that room, the curtains, the wallpaper, the wooden furniture, had been consumed by decades of Alabama humidity, bat guano, and the brutal cycling of summer heat. But the dress was still there, still on the mannequin, still standing, because it was made from heavy synthetic silk and lace, materials common in 1940s couture that simply do not decompose the way cotton or wood does. It isn't white anymore. Decades of moisture and bat droppings have turned it a sickly grayish yellow, the color of old teeth or old bone. The fabric is brittle, the lace crumbles if touched, but it is upright, still facing the window, still watching the dead street below, as if waiting for someone who was supposed to arrive. Positioned like that, a standing figure looking over ruins, it looks exactly like someone standing watch over a town that ceased to exist. From that window, you can see the collapsed rooftops of every other house on the street, every single one abandoned, every single one empty. But what was found hidden inside a wooden chest in England is something far darker than a dress and far harder to explain.
Number 5. Varosha, Cyprus. In the summer of 1974, Varosha was one of the most glamorous resort destinations in the entire Mediterranean. The beachfront district of Famagusta, on the eastern coast of Cyprus, was drawing international celebrities, Elizabeth Taylor, Brigitte Bardot, Richard Burton, to its gleaming high-rise hotels and white sand beaches. The Golden Sands, the Argo, the Florida Hotel, names that appeared on the covers of European travel magazines. Tourism was the city's entire economy and its entire identity. Then, on July 20th, 1974, Turkish military forces invaded northern Cyprus. The roughly 40,000 Greek Cypriot residents of Varosha fled in a matter of hours. They left everything: furniture, clothing, cars, entire hotel operations mid-season, kitchens stocked for a breakfast service that would never be served. They assumed they'd be back in days. Turkish forces sealed the entire district behind barbed wire and declared it a restricted military zone. For 50 years, almost nobody got in. Photographers who managed to shoot through the fences in the late 1970s documented hotel lobbies with food still on reception desks, clothing stores with mannequins dressed in 1974 fashions, cars rusting on streets where they'd been parked the morning of the invasion. Buildings began collapsing under the weight of vines and vegetation growing through their walls. The beaches, some of the finest in Cyprus, sat completely empty behind wire for 5 decades. Since 2020, Turkey has partially reopened sections amid significant international condemnation, but the sealed areas remain exactly as July 1974 left them. Beach chairs pointed at the sea, kitchens set for a service that never came, a city preserved in salt air and barbed wire, locked away from the people it belonged to. But there's a place in Ukraine where an attraction was purpose-built and not a single paying visitor ever walked through its gates.
Number 4. Fukushima Exclusion Zone, Japan. At 2:46 p.m. on March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck off the coast of Japan. Within hours, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant began melting down. The evacuation was so sudden and so total that the entire exclusion zone became a sealed time capsule of that exact Tuesday afternoon. Inside Okawa Elementary School, in the ghost town of Namie, the upper floor classrooms sat high enough above the valley that the tsunami didn't reach them. The radiation did, and nobody has touched those rooms since. The chalkboards still have March 11, 2011 written in the corner. Below it, handwritten notes from teachers during the initial earthquake remain exactly as written. Instructions to students, messages meant to hold them together. We will meet again. Stay strong. The desks are still in rows. Backpacks still hang on their hooks. Notebooks sit open to half-finished math problems and kanji exercises, mid-sentence, mid-equation. Because radiation kept looters out for years, literally every pencil and eraser is still sitting exactly where a child placed it when the siren started. There is something suffocating about that image. Not a single object disturbed. An entire room preserved in the exact moment when a generation of children had to run and leave everything behind, not knowing it was the last time they'd see any of it. Some of those backpacks still have lunchboxes inside them. Some notebooks have names written on the covers in small, careful handwriting. Names of children who had no idea at that moment that they would never come back to finish those problems. The radiation kept the room intact, perfectly, cruelly intact. But March 11th doesn't hold the only unexplained mystery on this list. In Italy, the mystery isn't what was destroyed, it's what was left behind on purpose, and nobody can explain why.
Number 3. Times Beach, Missouri. In the early 1970s, a waste hauler named Russell Bliss was hired by the town of Times Beach, Missouri, to spray waste oil on its unpaved roads. It was a common practice for a small town of about 2,000 people. Oil kept the dust down and cost almost nothing. Nobody asked what was in the oil. Nobody checked. What was in the oil was dioxin, specifically TCDD, one of the most acutely toxic chemical compounds ever synthesized, a byproduct of Agent Orange production that had been quietly mixed into the waste oil Bliss was dumping for hire. Dioxin doesn't wash away. It doesn't break down in soil. It binds to organic matter and stays for generations. The EPA didn't test Times Beach until 1982, by which point contamination levels throughout the town were hundreds of times above the threshold considered safe for human exposure. Then the Merrimack River flooded and spread contaminated soil into every neighborhood simultaneously. The federal government bought out the entire town, every house, every business, and mandated full evacuation. By 1985, Times Beach had ceased to exist as a municipality. Buildings were demolished. Contaminated soil was scraped up, hauled off, and incinerated. Today, the former site is a state park, Route 66 State Park, where visitors can walk trails and picnic on land that 2 generations ago was among the most contaminated residential zones in American history. The park office sits in the old roadhouse that served as the Flood Relief Center in 1982. The sign outside doesn't mention dioxin. It doesn't mention Russell Bliss. It doesn't mention the families who lost their homes, their health, and in some cases, their children. Missouri decided a recreational trail told a better story. But in Oklahoma, the contamination didn't come from a contract. It came from the ground itself, and it was aimed specifically at children.
Number 2. Oradour-sur-Glane, France. On June 10, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, a battalion of the Nazi Waffen-SS entered the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in the Haute-Vienne region of central France. In the space of a few hours, they murdered 642 people, every person in the village. The men were separated and shot in barns. The women and children were locked inside the village church, which was then set on fire. The village was burned to the ground. After the liberation, French President Charles de Gaulle made a decision that turned Oradour-sur-Glane into something unlike any other massacre site in the world. He ordered it preserved exactly as found, not rebuilt, not cleared, not cleaned. The ruins were to remain permanently as physical testimony. That order has been enforced for 80 years. The rusted hulks of cars sit on the main street, burned in place where they stopped on June 10, 1944. A woman's sewing machine sits in the rubble of what was her home. Children's shoes are scattered across the church floor, exactly where they fell. A bicycle fused by heat to a wall is still there. The precision of preservation is absolute. An entire village frozen not by a natural disaster, but by a deliberate act of remembrance ordered by a government that refused to let erasure happen. A new Oradour was built nearby for survivors and their descendants, but the ruins of the original remain an open-air crime scene, walked by visitors every year, where nothing has moved in 8 decades. Some foundations still hold household objects exactly as left on the morning of June 10th: plates, bottles, tools. History as an indictment. But one of the places on this list was abandoned not by violence or politics, but by something that moves at the pace of inches per year and cannot be stopped.
Number 1. Pitcher, Oklahoma. Pitcher, Oklahoma was a lead and zinc mining town that spent decades poisoning its own population before any official body did anything meaningful about it. The mines operated from the 1910s through the 1970s. Throughout that entire period, fine particulate waste called chat was piled into mountains flanking every neighborhood, gray-white mounds up to 12 stories high, looming over schools and playgrounds and backyards. Kids played on them. Dust blew through open windows and settled on kitchen counters and dinner tables. The groundwater was saturated with lead, cadmium, and zinc. By the time systematic blood testing was conducted in the 1990s, health officials found that more than 30% of Pitcher's children had blood levels high enough to cause permanent neurological damage. 30% of the children in a town quietly brain damaged before they were old enough to understand what was happening. Lead poisoning at that level doesn't produce visible symptoms parents would recognize as poisoning. It suppresses IQ, it impairs impulse control, it derails behavioral development. Entire generations of Pitcher children were neurologically compromised without their parents ever knowing the cause. The EPA designated Pitcher a Superfund site in 1983. The federally funded buyout and evacuation didn't happen until 2009, a 26-year gap between knowing and acting. What's left now are the Chat Mountains, crumbling structures, cratered roads, and contaminated groundwater that will outlast everyone alive today. On June 26, 2009, the last voluntary resident, a retired man named Gary Lindemann, locked his door, drove out, and didn't look back. 2 days later, a tornado destroyed most of what remained. But a beach resort on the Mediterranean was abandoned for a completely different reason, one backed by barbed wire and still enforced by a military that answers to no local authority.
Still curious? Then don't stop now. The next mystery is already waiting for you. Just click the video on screen. I saved it just for you. See you there, curious one.